Hey folks, and welcome to another edition of Zog Science. Today we're going to be taking a look at the part two of this series on the nervous system and look at how we integrate signals using our brain. So let's talk briefly about the evolution of the nervous system. Originally, with our most primitive animals, remember the nerve cells are only found in animals. With things like cnidarians, we have what is known as a nerve net. So there's no necessarily central control. There's no one place that's kind of sending instructions to the rest of the body. Rather, we just kind of have neurons that are, spread throughout the whole body, and they are connected to one another. But again, and so the organ is able to coordinate control. But again, there's no single place that is sending that out. Now, over time, the evolution that we see is that we begin to develop this kind of central nervous system. So, this central area that is able to control actions, and eventually that develops into a brain. So, we have a central nervous system with a brain. And along with that, we tend to see the trend of cephalization. Remember, cephalization is where we have a concentration of sensory organs in one position on the body. And that makes sense, right? If your brain is going to be doing the majority of the processing of your senses, then you want it to be able to react quickly. So having the brain close to where all your sensory organs are um, is going to allow you to do that much more quickly. And then you want the rest of your central nervous system to kind of spread throughout the body, where it can then be connected to your peripheral nervous system, which we'll talk about here in just a minute. So the human nervous system is made up of the central nervous system, which is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. And then you've got the peripheral nervous system, which is made up of your various nerves and some ganglia that spread throughout the rest of your body. And so the typical way that some sort of stimulus is going to impact you is that you have that external stimulus. That stimulus is then going to activate some receptors. Those receptors are going to go to some afferent neurons, which are neurons that are incoming to the brain. Those are then going to go to the central nervous system, which is where the information is processed. And that is then going to go back to the peripheral nervous system through efferent neurons, which are then going to either activate the motor system, which controls your skeletal muscles, or the autonomic system, which control the enteric, parasympathetic, and sympathetic divisions. And we'll get into those in just a little bit. So let's talk about motor versus the autonomic system. The motor system involves the control of your skeletal muscles. Those are generally voluntary, such as something like raising your hand. However, they can also be involuntary, such as reflexes. You then have the autonomic system, which is involuntary, and sometimes you can have interrupted control. So, for example, you have your autonomic system is controlling your breathing, which you continue to do, but you can have interrupted control of that, right? You can hold your breath. Now, sometimes you can't control it. For example, your digestive system works whether you want it to or not, right? It's just continuously going on. You don't really have any control over that. Same thing with your heart, right? You don't have control of your heart rate. Now, you can certainly control it with things like taking slower breaths, things like that, but you're not actually saying, hey, I want to beat it 70 beats per minute right now, right? That'd be too much to think about in order to make sure that you're accomplishing it. Again, the autonomic system is made up of the enteric system, which is your digestive control. You're not in control of your digestive system. And then you've got your sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Sympathetic, apparently, because I can't spell. Reflexes do not require the central nervous system in terms of going up into the brain. However, they do go into the spinal column. This allows for much faster reaction time. So these reflexes, they go directly into the spinal column and then they return back to the muscles or surrounding the reflex. For example, we did the lab where we were hitting the knees, right? That is then going to go into your central nervous system in your spinal column and right back in. Other things like, right, if you're touching something that's hot, you don't want the information to have to go up to your brain and then back down. You just want to quickly react and pull your hand back. So this is a very important evolutionary trait since after we discovered fire. All right, let's talk about the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nerve system. The parasympathetic system is involved in calming things and self-maintenance. So this is, where there's no stress, right? You don't need to be, on alert, anything like that. You want digestion to be occurring. So this promotes your enteric system to help your digestion occur properly. Whereas the sympathetic nerve system is involved in the fight or flight response. This is what activates when you get in that kind of situation. It does all these different things that are going to allow you to be able to react in times of stress. All right, let's talk about the brain. The brain is made up of two structures. We've got glial cells, which are for support. They are going to help nourish and take care of neurons, which are going to be doing all of the actual work. You can kind of see how those work here. The astrocyte is the same thing as a glial cell, and again, it's going to be helping to support the neurons that are found inside the central nervous system, helping to provide the nutrients coming in from various capillaries. Now, inside the brain, there are two different kind of things. We've got gray matter and we've got white matter. The gray matter consists of the cell bodies, nerve terminals, and dendrites, whereas the white matter consists of axons. So you notice that there's actually kind of a smaller portion of the brain total is actually the cell bodies and nerve terminals, whereas a much larger portion of it is the actual axons that are going to be traveling and crisscrossing and meeting different neurons to pass information along. Brain development occurs over time. There are kind of three main sections of the brain. You've got the forebrain, the midbrain, and then the hindbrain, and those develop into several different sections that perform different functions, and we'll get into some of those different functions here in a little bit. The brain is split between left and right hemispheres, so there are two hemispheres with a cut right down the middle. Now there is a piece that is connecting the two sides, that is the corpus callosum, and that is able to allow communication between the two sides of the brain within a few milliseconds. Now there's kind of a misnomer out there, which is that you have left brain people and you have right brain people. And the way this kind of rumor came about was that there were some studies that were done with people whose corpus callosums had been cut, and they found that certain sides of the brain did perform certain tasks when certain stimuli were put in, or when they were thinking about certain things. And that has kind of developed into this whole left brain, right brain thing. What actually happens is that if you're dealing with something creative, your left side of the brain, or sorry, your right side of the brain might activate first, but then your left side also activates as well. So it's not like it's just your right side of the brain that is doing creative things, and it's just your left side of the brain that is doing more reasoning, logical things. It's just that that side might activate first, and then it engages the other side of the brain, and they're kind of working together in order to accomplish the task. The other parts of the brain that are kind of important, we've got the medulla or the pons, which are part of the brain stem, and they are what help control the autonomic system. So the autonomic system is not really super involved with the actual cortex. Then you've got the cerebellum, which is important for balance and coordination, so a lot of movement and things like that. And then you've got the cerebrum, which is the actual kind of part of the brain that we think about. Oh, that looks like a brain. With all the wrinkles and everything. That is where a lot of the higher order, what we call higher order functions, thinking, reasoning, creativity, all those things happen in the cerebrum. Speaking, listening, all that kind of good stuff, writing, that would all be controlled by the cerebrum. Now you notice that we also have the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Remember, those are endocrine, part of the endocrine system, along with the pituitary gland. So don't forget about those. All right, so what are some of these higher order functions? Well, the cerebrum is kind of split into these different, what we call lobes. We've got the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and then the temporal lobe. And these are, associated with different things. So the frontal lobe is typically associated with like kind of thinking about things. It's called the association area because you tend to be thinking about, how do you relate different things? So how do you, when you see something, how do you then relate that to something else, right? That'd be association. But it also is involved in speech and motor control. And then, you can kind of see how different things are spread throughout the brain and used at different places. Now, that doesn't mean that those places, necessarily are the only places that are engaged while the brain is doing one of these particular tasks. However, those are the places that tend to be much more engaged um, than other areas, and tend to be kind of the ones that are doing the most during these types of activity. Now, just a quick aside, we tend to think about, oh, we've got a brain. There's the human brain. It looks a certain way, but brains look different, and they look different for different types of animals. So you can kind of see here the progression of, evolution over time, how different parts of the brain have been minimized in some animals and made much larger in other animals. So you can see, the fact that, the bird, reptile, amphibian, and bony fish, they don't actually have wrinkles in their brains. And that is the important. The wrinkles are one of those things that's kind of associated with a little bit higher order thinking. And it, kind of makes sense. Those organisms, they don't have a lot of the complex social behaviors that mammals have. They don't have a lot of that communication that mammals tend to show over those other organisms. And over here, you can kind of see some of the differences um, between different mammal brains. So you can get an idea that, they don't all look exactly the same. They all have different areas that are kind of more developed or underdeveloped, based on how that organism has evolved over time. So different parts of the brain are active for different tasks. We kind of saw that earlier. Um, and the way that they accomplish this, the way they kind of figure this out, is with an fMRI. It is based off of MRI technology where they're using magnetic resonance imaging. But the way that what they do, and the way that they figured this out was they determined that deoxygenated blood reacts differently in a magnetic field than oxygenated blood. Something about the way the oxygen is attached to the hemoglobin and how that affects the iron impacts how the magnetic field interacts with the blood. And so what they can do is they can look and see the differences in the changes. And so using computers, and MRI technology, they look for increased blood flow in areas of the brain while certain tasks are being accomplished. If there's increased blood flow in that part of the brain, that must mean that that is a more active area of the brain because they need more nutrients, more oxygen in order to continue to carry out the functions of the neurons firing. So what they do is they have people, do different tasks, listen to words, listen to music, whatever, and they kind of see what's happening. And they found some different areas of the brain that are associated with different things. For example, the amygdala is associated with an emotional response, and whenever people hear sad music, the amygdala tends to be a little more active. The nucleus accumbens is associated with the reward response, and so when people hear happy music, that area of the brain tends to be a little more active. So it's pretty interesting technology and definitely allows um, for some unique exploration and to kind of see how the brain works. Although certainly we don't know a lot. This is a kind of interesting aside. Dolphins sleep one hemisphere at a time. So remember the brain, two hemispheres. Dolphins are not the only animals that can do this. There are birds that can do this, as well as some other animals. And basically, the idea is that one hemisphere shuts down. When that one hemisphere shuts down, one of the eyes actually closes. The other one stays open, and the other hemisphere also stays on. And so, what they can do is they can be aware of their environments. So this would be good if there are a lot of predators around, or if they are migrating. What they can do is they can be awake, and if they're dolphins that are migrating, they can use the one part of the brain that is on to surface to breathe, because remember, dolphins need to be surfacing to breathe constantly. Or if they're birds, they can have one eye open and they can be, flying in their formation and still be sleeping and awake at the same time, which is pretty cool and definitely a unique uh, evolutionary technique that allows them to be able to deal with whatever situation they have. All right, we're going to talk very very basically about how learning occurs. Essentially, what happens is that the more a pathway is used in your brain. So let's think about something like simple like writing. Right, the first time you tried to write the letter A, you probably were not very good at it. And part of the reason why is because whatever pathway in your brain that told you to make that letter A had not been used very often. So you had a fairly weak connection there. The neurons, weren't easily firing in order to send the communication down the way. What we find is that as a pathway is reused and used over again, that connection becomes stronger, and we call this plasticity, or basically the synapses, the connections between two neurons um, are flexible. And so what happens is that as you write that A over and over again, right, you are associating that motor movement of your hand with the meaning in your mind of, okay, this is an A, right? Sound. Okay. And as you continue to make that association, the connection becomes stronger and stronger. You maybe get more synapses that develop. Maybe if there are two neurons that are connected to one, you get a stronger response at the same time. Lots of different ways, but that's essentially how learning occurs. As you repeat a process, you build the nerve image, right? So as you all know, but at this point, you all can write the letter A and you don't even think about it, right? You just do it. That's because you have made such a strong connection that as soon as you know that that's what you want to do, it just kind of happens automatically and you're not really thinking about having to do it. Whenever you try something new, you have to think about what you're doing because you need to now create those new neurons over time. So what happens is that as you get older and older, right, you've really strengthened in some of your things that you're learning. Now you may become a little less plastic overall, like it's much harder to learn languages when you're older, but the things that you do know, you can much more easily build off of those things, right? Because, okay, I have some knowledge, I have a lot of these connections in my brain. Well, if I'm taking, one connection and adding something a little new onto it, that's not such a big deal, right? Because this is a super strong connection. I'm just going to add maybe, another pathway kind of onto this. So that's the basics of learning. Again, it's much more complicated than that. This is just the real basics. Um, so this is kind of what can happen over time if you were to take a look at something like this. Is that maybe you have what's called long-term potentiation, which is where you get a stronger and more easily initiated action potential. And what happens is that you would have some sort of receptor that would attach to the cell to give another receptor that basically would allow for even stronger reactions, right? So as opposed to maybe having like one channel, maybe you have like 3 or 4 channels now, which allows for a much easier, um, uh, you allow for more of the sodium ions to be transmitted, basically is what happens. And then that allows the action potential to happen much more easily, and it's also much stronger, which propagates the signal, uh, down the axon. Mental illness, again, these are all things we're going to talk about in very broad strokes. But basically, mental illness can be a lot of times a disruption in the transmitter either release or uptake. Sometimes it can be genetic. We have slightly better understanding of some mental illnesses, but there's still a lot of questions. A lot of it we don't really understand. If we take a look at some drugs like opiums and heroines and nicotines and things like that, they can mimic some of the effects of mental illnesses that can have. And again, it can be, there's lots of different things that can happen and kind of how those things all interact with one another is being studied extensively right now. Again, lots of Nobel prizes out there for those of you who are going to become scientists. Brain damage. You can have lots of different effects from brain damage. It depends completely on the injury. It's very hard to predict. Phineas Gage was a guy who had a piece of iron bar that came up through his cheek and out through his brain, and he was able to survive. But it did alter his personality pretty significantly because it went through his brain and had a pretty big effect on him. You also have Alzheimer's, which affects a lot of people, and it's becoming kind of this bigger thing. And kind of related to Alzheimer's is dementia. Alzheimer's is associated with protein plaques, so you have these proteins that kind of build up around your neurons, and so it kind of shuts down some of the connections in your brain, and so now you're not able to make these connections, so you're not associating things properly. So that's where you kind of get that forgetfulness of I don't remember these things. Well, it's because you've got these plaques that are shutting down these connections between these neurons, making it hard for your brain to make the connections that it really should. So with the brain, there's tons of questions, still about how it all kind of fits together. But again, there's lots of cool stuff out there. So a lot of interesting possibilities and angles to research. So, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.